ZTV 25 Cleveland.
This is a husky named Balto, and he's the hero of today's story, Race Against Death by Seymour Wright. This true story started back in 1925 on a cold winter afternoon in January 21st at 4:30. Dr. Curtis Welch got a call from Mrs. Stanley. She wanted him to come have a look at her 6-year-old son, Richard. When Dr. Welch got there, it didn't take him long to diagnose Richard's illness. He'd already seen it in 2 or 3 other cases. It was diphtheria. Dr. Welch knew how contagious and how deadly diphtheria was. He knew that the germs were passed through the air by coughing, and with all the people indoors for the winter, those germs would pass even faster. So he rushed back to the hospital to see how much diphtheria serum he had, and he had very little, not enough for even one person. He knew an epidemic was about to break out and something had to be done. He had to get serum, much more serum. But how could it be brought to Nome? Nome was completely iced in. Ships couldn't get through, there were no trains, and in 1925, airplanes couldn't fly in air that was 40 degrees below zero.
The radio in Nome often clicked busily, but so far today had been a quiet one. Sergeant Anderson was a little bored. He stretched and looked at his watch. Another hour and he'd be off duty. The door to the shack suddenly swept open, bringing in a gust of snow. Anderson recognized a good friend. "Oh, you look frozen. Help yourself to some coffee, Doc." Dr. Curtis Welch unbuttoned his coat and pulled off his heavy gloves. "Thanks. I can sure use some." Sipping his hot coffee, the doctor was thoughtful. He had just come from a meeting at the mayor's office, a meeting he had asked for. The town's leading citizens had all been there. The worried doctor had told him the bad news. "I'm afraid diphtheria's broken out. We've had 2 deaths so far." and another little boy is very sick. I'm sure there are other cases we don't even know about yet. Gentlemen, we may have an epidemic on our hands. The faces around the table were grave. They all knew how serious this kind of problem could be. Well, how much antitoxin do we have? Dr. Welch shrugged. Well, there's a small amount on hand, but it's pretty old. If things get bad, even that won't last more than a few days. Our only hope is to get fresh serum. Mr. Thornton scratched his chin and frowned. Well, there's plenty of it back in the States, all we'd ever need, but I don't see how they can get it to us in time. Then we'll simply have to find some closer to home, Mayor Maynard said. He turned to the doctor. Curtis, I authorize you to draft the radio message and give it top priority. Have our radio people contact Fairbanks, Juneau, and Anchorage. Pass the word along. We must have serum at once. It's an emergency. We'll take anything they can spare. Dr. Welch nodded. He wondered what would happen if there wasn't any serum to be found. But he tried not to think about that. Now, in the little radio shack, the doctor took a slip of paper from his pocket and handed it to Sergeant Anderson. I came straight from the mayor's office, Sergeant. He wants this to go out immediately, to all stations. The sergeant read the scribbled message carefully. He and the doctor exchanged a slow, thoughtful look. And then, without a word, Anderson sat down at the wireless set. He put on his earphones and began tapping the key. Nome calling. Nome calling. Nome calling. Soon the answer came back. Go ahead, Nome. We're standing by. The sergeant's trained fingers flew up and down, sending the dots and dashes that spelled the call for help. Diphtheria outbreak in Nome. We need serum badly. Can you spare any serum? Can you help us? Can you help us?
Just 4 days later, on January the 24th, there were 20 new cases of diphtheria. Dr. Welch knew that he was going to run out of the little bit of serum he had very, very soon. And then a small miracle, a phone call from Anchorage. They had received his message, and they had 300,000 units of fresh diphtheria serum. Now the problem was how to get it from Anchorage to Nome. Well, from Anchorage, it could be taken on a train all the way up to Nenana. But from Nenana all the way over to Nome, the only safe way to take it would be by dog sled. The decision was made. The serum would go by train and dog sled. On January the 27th, it was put on a train tightly packed and made it to Nenana by 11 o'clock that night. The relay teams were already there and ready to start. Several men started out from Nenana toward Nome with their dog sleds. And at the same time in Nome, a champion dog sled driver, Leonard Seppala, set out to meet them. He had two very good dogs, Scotty and Togo. He had a lot of confidence in those dogs. And they met their last relay man 170 miles from Nome. Then he turned around and headed back to Nome. But at that very moment, a tremendous blizzard broke. There was no way Leonard Seppala could make it 170 miles in a blizzard. Luckily, they had thought about that in Nome, and they sent out two backup men, Charlie Olson and Gunnar Kasson. Olson met Seppala, took the serum, and then brought it to Gunnar Kasson. Gunnar Kasson took the serum on the last leg all the way to Nome. By this time, the blizzard was in full rage. Not only that, he was trying out a new lead dog, an untried dog named Balto.
Balto swung quickly to the left. He moved on, testing the ground, until he found the trail again. This happened time after time during the long night. Each time they circled a drift or skirted a patch of weak ice, Balto brought them back to the right place. Gunnar Kasson smiled with satisfaction. Balto was proving himself. As the miles passed, Kasson felt the cold spreading under his clothes. He hopped off the bar and jogged behind the sled. It made his blood flow fast, and he felt warmer, but it only lasted a moment. Like the other relay drivers, he wore many layers of clothing, and for a good reason. The heat from his body stayed trapped in these layers, giving him a cushion of warmth. But when a fierce wind blew, it went right through the layers. It blew away his cushion of body heat, and there was nothing to stop the chill. This was known in the far north as wind chill. Now Casson felt the chill creeping across his skin. It seemed to crawl into his chest, his stomach, his muscles, into his very bones. He tried running again. He shook his hands and he moved his stiff fingers in their sealskin gloves. He slapped his cheeks, which were beginning to feel numb. The sled crept through the darkness, and the storm closed in. Soon Casson could only see as far as his wheel dogs. These were the two dogs nearest to the sled. Casson knew that somewhere in front, Balto was leading them faithfully. But the driver no longer had any control. He was cut off in a wild, gray nightmare. The sled handles were his only contact with reality, and he gripped them tightly. Balto threw a quick look over his shoulder. He too felt alone. All he could see now were the two dogs directly behind him. Everything else was lost in the whirlwind. The husky yelped loudly to reassure the others. Then he pushed on. Head down, nose to the ground. Find the scent. Stay alert. Keep the team moving. Whatever happens, follow the trail. The sled bumped and tilted. Casson knew they were moving up a steep hill. As they struggled upward, he kept breathing through his nose. His chest felt ready to burst, and he longed to open his mouth wide and take in great gulps of air. But he knew that it would mean frozen lungs and death. It seemed like days before the sled crested the hill and started down the far side. The tired dogs half slid through the thick, powdery snow. At the bottom, Casson set his brake and the team rested. But in this kind of storm, even resting was an effort. 10 minutes later, they were moving again. They mushed for miles through heavy woods, and they reached a snow-covered plain. In summer, this was a swampy marshland, but now it was frozen solid. On the open plain, the Arctic wind went mad. An angry gust lifted the sled and the dogs, and it flung them aside. The team fell in a wild tangle of harness. Casson tumbled head over heels as though slapped by a huge, invisible hand. With a groan, the driver pulled himself to his feet. He staggered over to the dogs and began to untangle their gear. When he straightened up the sled, he glanced into it, and his heart almost stopped beating. The package of serum wasn't there. The weary man couldn't believe his eyes. Well, he realized with a sick feeling he had tied it hurriedly back at Bluff. The ropes must have worked loose. And as the sled bounced over the trail, the package must have fallen out. Oh, but where did it happen? Did he lose it hours ago, or just now when the sled was blown over? In a panic, Casson threw himself into the snow. It was too dark to see well, so he groped blindly, his heart pounding. He had to find the serum. He couldn't lose it now, not when they were so close to their goal. Balto and the other huskies stood by obediently while Casson floundered in the drifts, feeling with his gloved hands. Oh, let me find it. Please let me find it. Casson fought against terror. The serum had to be here. It had to be here somewhere. Half sobbing, he crawled round and round, going in wider circles. Snow was whipping into his face. Splinters of ice cut through his gloves, and it slashed at his knees. But he felt nothing. Nothing but a deadly, creeping fear.
I know you're going to be upset with me for not telling you how it all comes out. But if I told you, then you'd miss a terrific reading experience. Just go to the library and ask for this book, Race Against Death by Seymour Wright.